Education is behavior modification. This is a place where condoms are being handed out to middle schoolers. 10% of children in public schools have been targets of unwanted sexual attention by school staff. Nearly half of all high schoolers have had premarital sex. This is a place where children are indoctrinated with worldviews like secular humanism, Darwinism, even postmodern relativism, that there are no morals, right or wrong. So your children are little lumps of dough, hostages being collected from the private homes of America that they are going to shape and form according to their will. Satan's agenda is to gain control of the minds of children. They can get so deeply into crafting and controlling that mind that even the wishes and desires and motives of the child are under their control. Education does not mean teaching people to know what they do not know. It means teaching them to behave as they do not behave. "2,500 years ago in ancient Babylon, the situation of social control was not a whole lot different than it is today. You might remember the history of the Jews in captivity in Babylon. They took this people in and then they needed to propagandize them. The best and brightest, maybe Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, for example, needed to have their minds shaped according to the Babylonian way of thinking. So what do you read? And right out of the gates in Daniel 1, you read that these youth were trained in the thinking, the literature of Babylon. Their minds were to be formed and shaped according to the Babylonian worldview. Now, of course, God's people resisted this, but this was the aim and the agenda of the social elite, the elite of that society. Well, fast forward to 1962. In a report called The Role of Schools in Mental Health, we read the following, a federal document. Education does not mean teaching people to know what they do not know. It means teaching them to behave as they do not behave. This session, Schooled Part 2, we're looking at social control. That this schooling system was not just an industrialist concept to corral the masses into a factory system to work as cogs in their machines, but it is a system of a social agenda, a worldview shaping. You're going to see some incredible things about the history that continues to today. And we have now 2 definitions of education under our belt. The first definition from the first session is that the definition of education, scientifically defined, said William Torrey Harris, the U.S. Commissioner of Education, is the subsumption of the individual. So get rid of individuality, merge the individuality into the collective, and we don't want people to be thinkers. The second definition we now have is education does not mean teaching them to know things that they don't know. Education is behavior modification. We mistakenly think that education exists, that the schools exist to teach the children the 3 R's. We think that it's trying to help them to become the best them that they can become. Education is not about intellectual learning. It's not about learning skills and becoming accomplished and having an initiative to go out and be creative and live life, chart your own course as led by God. No, it's about falling in line, behaving how you do not behave. It's behavior modification. The U.S. Department of Education in 1969 put out another document called Designing Education for the Future. And they also defined education. The definition of education, according to the U.S. government, a means to achieve important economic, from last session, and social goals of a national character. We're talking about those social goals. How do you form society? The nation's school system exists to serve these important goals, the social goals. And this agenda to remake the schools began over 100 years ago. Let's go all the way back to actually one of my favorite books about education. It is my favorite. It's called Education. And in 1903, this book was published, and it's the best philosophy of education you'll ever read. And by the way, I'm doing a follow-up seminar to this. This is a pretty dark history, isn't it? I mean, we're pulling back the veil and exposing some pretty lurid things and bad things of what's going on. But we need to say, hey, what is God's plan? What is God's answer to this? Because there was a movement forming at the same time. These streams of history are running parallel with each other. The Great Advent Awakening, the movement of the remnant people, at the same time as this schooling propaganda mechanism. How do we understand this story? How do we understand the schooling, or the educational, rather, methods that God has birthed within His people? That's a follow-up seminar I'm going to do called Undoctrinated. But before I get to that, I got to share with you, rather than Education being the most popular book in 1903, it was actually Thomas Davidson's History of Education. This was the book everybody was talking about in the first couple of years of the 1900s. This actually was the textbook for teachers of the College Department of Education in the teachers' training of America. In the preface to the book, Thomas Davidson states, "My endeavor has been to present education as the last and highest form of evolution." So now we have a number of definitions of education here. Education is not about children learning and becoming individuals. It's about evolving, evolution. Now this isn't evolution of the species, because the species human is not going to change from that. What this is social Darwinism, the evolution of society into something else that we are going to construct. And this evolution doesn't happen naturally. They believe that the survival of the fittest and the natural selection takes place, and species evolve according to nature's forces, but society must evolve according to the forces that we will put in place. And so we must have social controllers. We must have a system. And you know what? The old ways are going to have to give way to the new way. You know, the old ways of self-reliance and family and small-time community and small farms, and this is going to have to be removed in order for the new highly evolved social order to take place. And how is it going to take place? Schooling. Listen to Elwood Cubberley. This is probably the most important person, again, in moving 20th century education into place. He wrote the following: However much we have lost interest in the old problems of faith and religion, the American people have come to believe thoroughly in education. So schooling is taking the place of religion. Faith and religion are out, schooling is in. And this theme, by the way, is echoed by the National Education Association themselves. And they stated, in today's time even, in 1997, you hear from Bob Chase of the National Education Association. He says, education is the modern world's temporal religion. So education is the religion of today. But back to 100 years ago, John Dewey was very clear. We saw this quote last time. Every teacher should realize he is a social servant set apart for the maintenance of the proper social order. The teacher always is the prophet of the true God and the usherer in of the true kingdom of God. So these elites believed they were bringing something in, a new kingdom, a new utopia, if you will. This is the true kingdom of God. They were true believers in this, although it's straight from the heart of Satan, as we've seen. But Social Control was written by Edward Ellsworth Ross, and this is a book that was published on how you control society. I mean, you see it right in the title, Social Control. It was published in 1901, and this book revolutionized the social sciences. It had huge influence on political science, on psychology, and Edward Ross used a very interesting analogy when he announced the intentions of the social engineers. Here's what he said. He said their goal was to collect little plastic lumps of human dough from private households and shape them on the social kneading board. So collect your children, collect the children from the private households, and we will do the shaping. Doesn't that remind you of the Rockefeller Education Board's quotation where they said, in our dreams they yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. This is exactly what's been happening for over 100 years. And Ross wasn't the only one saying it. Arthur Calhoun wrote a book called A Social History of the American Family. This was the establishment text on how family was becoming less important in the 20th century, turn of the century times. He explained, the child passes more and more into the custody of community experts who are qualified to perform the complexer functions of parenthood. So who is doing the parenting now? It's the community experts, the state, the schools, the public school system. They are the ones, the community experts, who are doing the parenting, the complex, difficult things that parents somehow can't do, even though they've done for thousands of years. Elwood Cubberley, again, one of the most important people in the formation of 20th century schooling, stated also that in particular, the attitude toward control of the child is likely to change. Each year, the child is coming to belong more to the state and less to the parent. The plea in defense that the child is my child will not be accepted much longer in society. That's pretty chilling, isn't it? And this is not brand new, even in Cubberley's day in the early 1900s. Way back in the 1840s, when Mann was getting this movement underway, just a couple of decades later, in 1867, he stated the following: we then who are engaged in the sacred cause of education are entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause. So your children are little lumps of dough, hostages being collected from the private homes of America that they are going to shape and form according to their will. And if you read in educational counsels from like the book Education, in Fundamentals of Christian Education and counsels to parents, teachers, and students, excellent Christian educational philosophy books, you read what might be a pretty radical, from today's standards, view of education, that you're supposed to delay formal education until 8 or 10. You shouldn't be pushing so much academics at an early age, that you're supposed to equalize mental and physical labor. These are seemingly quite radical things, and people react and they go, oh, how could you suggest such a thing? I mean, let's just do school like normal. But wait a minute. Maybe school like normal is actually a lot more radical than we thought. Because if you think about it, the idea of parents voluntarily yielding up their children full-time, all day, almost year-round, for 12 to 13 years of schooling, to be molded by community experts who are largely strangers to the parents, this has got to be the most radical idea in human history. Radical in a negative sense. I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of insane, isn't it? And what are the fruits of this? Are families closer together? Are families stronger together now than they used to be, or the opposite? The communists knew exactly what to do if they wanted to control society. How do you control society? You remove religion, you destroy the family, you get the kids corralled into this system of government schooling, and that is exactly what the Communist Manifesto called for. The 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto wrote that they called for universal schooling. And we also read abolition of the family, replace home education with social. Children should not be educated in the home. That is the greatest enemy. That is the worst possible thing you can have from the point of view of the social controllers. It's not just taking children hostage. It's not just destroying the family, but we also read in the 1990s they even need to reach the parents. This is a more recent document, Guide to Getting Out Your Message, that says the following: enlightened social engineering is required. Parents and the general public must be reached also. Otherwise, the children and youth enrolled in globally oriented programs may find themselves in conflict with values assumed in the home. And then the educational institution frequently comes under scrutiny and must pull back. So you hear them talking about it. They're saying, you know what, we don't want to be scrutinized. We're not going to be able to push our agenda forward as quickly because parents are going to object because we're teaching their children things that the parents don't hold as their values. So we have to reach the parents. We have to reach the broader community, the general public. If you watch the news, there was actually a very important high-level government official in the cabinet of the White House who came out and said, we should have schooling year-round. The schools should be open for 12, 13, 14 hours per day. And schools should be the center of community life, he said. And they should have potlucks and programs and lots of things. And by the way, you could arguably favor this sort of thing with altruistic motives, but what is the real movement behind this? The real movement behind this, as you just heard, is to reach the community, reach the parents, and get everybody on board. By the way, potlucks, the center of community and social life, doesn't this sound a little bit like something that the church used to do in the old days and hopefully presently today, that we have our own communities, but now the school is seeking to take place of that all and has been for over 100 years. Remember, in the 19th century, compulsory schooling began with a short term of just 10 to 12 weeks, and now it's nearly the whole year round, and they're proposing even more. This behemoth just never stops growing since it was founded in the mid-19th century. Now, if you're going to replace religion and the family with a new social order, you're going to have to do something very important. And that is, you're going to have to get rid of God Himself. And so, just as Prussian-style modern schooling is coming into American education in the 1900s, around 1890, when this movement really started moving forward, you also see the textbooks start to change. And no surprise, you see evolution coming in. Listen to these two statements from these publishing companies. Yale University Press stated, "We do not know of any competent naturalist who has any hesitation in accepting the general doctrine, meaning of evolution." Macmillan Publishers said, "There is no rival hypothesis to evolution, except the outworn and completely refuted one of special creation, now retained only by the ignorant, dogmatic, and the prejudiced." So 1895, they're coming in and saying, we're going to remove God, creation, from the textbook, and we're going to bring in evolution because it is the consensus after all, and all the scientists are teaching this and believing it. And it wasn't just the textbooks that were changed. The textbooks were changed to remove God, but even the children's storybooks were changed to reinvent the value system of children. This woman on the screen that you see is named Mary Lystad. She's a biographer of children's literary history. And in her writings, she has shown that in the late 19th century, right around this time, the themes of children's books started to change. In the mid-19th century, they were about character development and salvation and things like that. But after 1890, here's what happens. Characters begin to aspire for school credentials rather than experiences and life lessons as the early literature had showed children. Children also were not to do any manual labor. That was demeaned. They were not to work at all until their late teens or even later. This, by the way, again, was the opposite of the values of a generation before, where it was presented that, if you're sitting idly in a school for long periods, that's actually frowned upon in children's literature. So as the 20th century continued, this agenda becomes more pronounced in the textbooks, in the children's literature, and then by 1948, a Carnegie-funded study made the following incredible statement. A society could be completely made over in something like 15 years. The time it takes to inculcate a new culture into a rising group of youngsters. And the Carnegie Endowment wasn't the only group saying this. Harold Rugg, who was funded by the Rockefellers, stated that their aim was scientific reconstruction of our social order. He goes on, a new public mind is to be created. How do you create a new public mind? Only by creating tens of millions of individual minds. I want you to think about that for a second. He just said, we are going to create minds. The child comes as a lump of clay. We are going to create them. We have a counterfeit creator here. This is a scary thought. So this is how you have the social reconstruction of the social order, the scientific reconstruction of the social order. You create tens of millions of individual minds, and then you weld them into a new social mind. He goes on and says, through the schools of the world, we shall disseminate a new conception of government, one that will embrace all the activities of men, one that will postulate the need of scientific control. We want scientific control over their minds. We're going to create their minds and then weld them together with millions of other minds to create a new social mind. And this is a new conception of government because we have the power over them. B.F. Skinner was a very important individual in the history of control. He founded the field of study of operant conditioning with his studies. And in his field of behaviorism, he really looked into how do you actually control the mind? And he stated the following. We can achieve a sort of control under which the controlled nevertheless feel free. They are doing what they want to do, not what they are forced to do. There is no restraint and no revolt. By a careful cultural design, we control not the final behavior, but the inclination to behave, the motives, the desires, the wishes. They can get so deeply into crafting and controlling that mind that even the wishes and desires and motives of the child are under their control. And you think what's coming up from within you is real. It's organic. It's part of your identity. You think that you are making your own choices and thinking your own thoughts, but he says, nope, they think they're free, but they're really not. We have control over even their motives and thoughts and desires. Bertrand Russell said the population will not be allowed to know how its convictions were generated. And Aldous Huxley said, we are in the process of developing a whole series of techniques which will enable the controlling oligarchy, who have always existed and presumably always will exist, to get the people to love their servitude. So you hear they're using techniques, he said. We're developing techniques, B.F. Skinner, other techniques. What sorts of techniques are going to get people to love their servitude? Get people to the point where they will not even know how their convictions were generated. To get people to think they're free even though they're totally controlled. Let's listen to Bertrand Russell tell us about these techniques. It is to be expected that advances in physiology and psychology will give governments more control over individual mentality than they now have even in totalitarian countries. He goes on and says, Fichte laid it down that education should aim at destroying free will, so that after pupils have left school, they shall be incapable through the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. Diet, here are the methods. Diet, injections, and injunctions will combine from a very early age to produce the sort of character and the sort of beliefs that the authorities consider desirable. And any serious criticism of the powers that be will become psychologically impossible. That is a serious statement right there. He says, watch this. Diet, injections, and injunctions. Now, 2,500 years ago, they had the injunctions in ancient Babylon, the teachings, the orders, the commands, and they had the diet. Remember, they said, you guys are going to be put on this diet. And the guys said, test us in this. And they got away with not eating that diet. But part of the propaganda is food, injunctions. They didn't have injections but back then, but today we certainly have that ability. And again, people at the time of Bertrand Russell, at the time of Aldous Huxley, at the time of B.F. Skinner, when these Rockefeller and Carnegie and other institutions are pushing this forward, people at the time were blowing the whistle. The Reese Commission, 1954, U.S. Congress stated the following after their investigation of the secret papers of these tax-free foundations. They said, the concentration of foundation power has tended to promote moral relativity to the detriment of our basic moral, religious, and governmental principles. It has tended to promote the concept of social engineering, that foundation-approved social scientists alone are capable of guiding us into better ways of living. The impact of foundation money upon education has been very heavy, tending to promote uniformity in approach and method, tending to induce the educator to become an agent for social change and a propagandist for the development of our society in the direction of some form of collectivism. The net result has been to promote internationalism in a particular sense, a form directed toward world government and a degradation of American nationalism. Now, people look back at the Reese Commission and say, well, Congress is just a bunch of conspiracy theorists, and, to talk about world government, you just can't do that. You've crossed the line there. And you know what? When you mention the concept of a conspiracy theory, I have to be the first one to say, I do not want to buy into some cooked up nonsense conspiracy theory. It's easy to make up a conspiracy. It's easy to spot them. So don't be fooled by nonsense that is out there. There's plenty of nonsense. But on the other hand, if we toss out the concept that, hey, actually, maybe there is a powerful elite that has an agenda, no, there just can't be. Well, how reasonable is that? We have this knee-jerk reaction. If it sounds conspiratorial, it must not be true. Well, isn't that convenient for the devil to get a message through, an agenda through, because nobody will believe that anything nefarious ever goes on in society. But don't take it from Congress. You can say, okay, these guys are a bunch of, this is Congress, and a national investigation was launched, but some people say they just don't believe it because it's Congress. But let's listen to their words. Let's listen to David Rockefeller. He's a modern Rockefeller. He wrote a book called Memoirs, where he admitted the following. He said, for more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have attacked the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal, working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. Now, the first time I read this quote, it sounds like he's scoffing at the notion that, well, yeah, we're conspiring. People think we're working against the best interests of the United States. People think we're trying to build one world system here. Listen to the rest of the quote. He says, if that is the charge, I stand guilty and am proud of it. So we are conspiring. We are trying to build a one-world global political and economic structure that is integrated. We are working against the best interests of the United States. We are part of a secret group, he says. All of this is the charge. I am guilty and proud of it. So don't ever listen to a theorist just listen to what they say themselves about what they are doing. Then you don't have to theorize, and then you're in safe intellectual water. You're drawing rational and logical conclusions when you just allow them to say it for themselves. By the way, this concept of a new world order, a one world system, how do you move it forward? He didn't mention schooling in the quote, but listen to this statement by Harvard psychiatrist Chester M. Pierce. This was in 1973 at a Children's International Education Seminar. And in this seminar, he was quoted as saying the following by the newspapers who were in attendance. Every child in America entering school at the age of 5 is mentally ill because he comes to school with certain allegiances to our founding fathers, toward our elected officials, toward his parents, toward a belief in a supernatural being, and toward the sovereignty of this nation as a separate entity. It is up to you as teachers to make all these sick children well by creating the international child of the future. Now that's some quote right there. And people say, why haven't I heard any of this? I hope you've asked that question. How come we were not taught this? Well, why haven't the history books reported on this very interesting history, this very important history? All the way back in 1919, the London Times, ironically on July 4 of 1919, the London Times put out a report where they were explaining how the propaganda machine in the United States was underway and was functioning. Listen to what these reports said. Efficiently organized propaganda should mobilize the press, the church, the stage, and the cinema, press into active service the whole education systems of both countries, the homes, the universities, public and high schools, and the primary schools, and then this, histories should be revised. New books should be added, particularly to the primary schools. Another article in the same issue of the London Times said that a movement to correct the school books of the United States has been started, and it will go on. So in the early 20th century, not only were they bringing this movement in, but they were retelling the story, the history of American education and all of American history. Because again, they didn't want too much history. Remember, the National Education Association said, get rid of history, bring social studies in, because we don't want people too aware of their own history, because that will, well, as we heard earlier, having too much education, too much intellectual education will cause discontent. Now, as a history teacher myself, I had an occasion to survey dozens of history textbooks, and as part of a textbook adoption program. And as I'm looking through these and looking at the themes and the headings and the flow of how they tell the story, I'm going, these are all virtually the same thing. It's almost as if they're reading off the same establishment script. And I would hear, this textbook offers this different angle on things, and this one offers a little different hue on the perspective on history. And I'm going, okay, that's a minor little thing, but where is the history of Edward Bernays and the movement of public relations and propaganda? Where is the history of American schooling? Where is the history of what the Constitution is actually about and understanding American freedom? All of these things are largely absent from the textbooks, and you get a whole new, what's called social history of America. And all the textbooks are pretty much reading off the same script. How does this happen? How do you get to the point where within a culture, intellectual culture, academia, if you will, that everybody becomes so like-minded, that thought becomes so blocked in within one box? I actually experienced this right out of the gates in my college Department of Education. As a history major, I remember one of the very first things I remember hearing was, now you can write a paper in this class and you can research on just about, anything you want, but please don't do any research. Do not submit a paper to me on the John F. Kennedy assassination. Now, at the time, I thought, well, that's weird. Why can't you do a paper on JFK assassination? And he said, well, it's conspiracy theory, and that's why. So it's not allowed. So this sort of history that we've been doing for the last two sessions is not permitted in the academia. You're given an article, a very important article called the Paranoid Style in American Politics, that inducts you into scoffing at anything conspiratorial. And so you're just not supposed to go there. Just like if you're wondering how the history becomes so controlled, let me give you the example of how the biology becomes so controlled. You know that if you're in any of the hard sciences in the universities of America, if you introduce the idea of intelligence or design in nature, and you say, well, look at this evidence. Let's examine the possibility of intelligent design. There's no way you're going to get away with that. You will be marginalized. You will not get peer reviewed and published. Occasionally people slip through that, but for the most part, these people are pushed aside. Sometimes they're removed from their jobs entirely, but definitely they receive a lot of scorn. There's a lot of peer pressure and actual pressure being put on not studying anything but the script. Evolutionary theory. And so just like we've seen that in the hard sciences, it happens the same in the social sciences within the history department. I'll share a quick story with you from my own experience. When I got into the master's level of the social sciences was history, government, political science, and economics. I thought about studying national security studies as my master's degree. And so I got into the first class, the 401 level class of the master's program. And this is the introductory national security studies class. National security studies means, intelligence, defense department, warfare, international relations, all of that. And the first book we read was written by Niccolo Machiavelli. and it was called The Prince. If you're familiar with Machiavelli, he's famous for advocating a political philosophy which we would call the end justifies the means approach. He talked about how the prince or the government official needs to engage in the noble lie, he called it. Sometimes you need to deceive your public for their own good. And so basically you need to do things as an official in government that wouldn't be moral for the rest of people, but you just need to do these wicked things in order to maintain power, in order to maintain order in the society. And after reading this, I get back to class, I figure we're all going to, speak about this and say, yeah, this is crazy stuff, isn't it? And I get back and the climate in the room is, yes, this is important. Yes, we must do this. And there's no criticism of Machiavelli's theory. And I'm sitting in my chair going, wait a minute, am I the only one that didn't agree with this? And so, I contribute my thoughts to that, and look out, oh boy, now you're marginalized. And now the discussion is, we got to eliminate that viewpoint. This was the first class in the master's program for national security studies at the university I attended, because they have you reading Machiavelli as to induct you into this way of thinking. And so at this point, I'm not going to fit into this program. So I just check out. I didn't realize it was sort of a weeding out process, but I said, I'm not going to go into this program. This is not for me. So I launched into the social science program, where it was government, economics, and history. Now, in the social science program, I sort of played ball. I didn't, do a lot of dissent, and I kind of wish I could go back and do more of that. But, I wanted to get the good grade and please the education departments and get the leveling up there in the pay scale and get the master's degree with the good grades. So get it on my resume. I wanted to be a part of that system. And anyway, at the time, I didn't question much, but when it came to my last class, maybe I was getting a little reckless, a little adventurous. I came to the professor. It was a class on globalization. And I said, I'd like to do a paper, a research project, because we all got to choose our own research project. I said, I want to study the forces behind globalization, because it's not just some inevitable thing. I mean, certainly the internet has bound us closer together, but there are also agendas and movers who at the high levels of society want to see this thing go forward and want to see a one world system imposed. And he said, okay, you may do that, but just make sure not to do any conspiracy theories. So he did say that. And so I studied the organizations, the groups, the private meetings, the secret gatherings of the elite who have this viewpoint of what you might call a new world order. And I worked really hard on the paper. I did my absolute best, presented it to the class. The students were loving it. They were like, man, this is really interesting. But then I got my grade back from the professor. And it was marked up with no conspiracy theories. You may not talk about this. You may not talk about this. And he gave me a C. Now, this is the first C that I have ever gotten, okay, ever. And I'd gotten straight A's through this, I told you I played ball, and I'm not proud of that. They gave me the most outstanding student award, which is actually kind of shameful to me that I got all these A's and pleased all these, but gave all the professors what they wanted to hear. I kind of wish that I would have been more of an independent thinker when I did that. But I was for this project, and independent thinking was not allowed. You get a C. It was the only time I got a C in that whole program. Isn't that something? And then I had to take one more class too, that same semester, as I was finishing up my master's program. I needed to take a political science class. And it just so happened that the top level class of the other program that I had left, the National Security Studies master's program, their top level class was meeting at a time where I could go. And so I signed up for that, sort of be a fly on the wall. I'm not in their program, but it's a political science class, so I can count those credits toward my social science master's. Now, I said this is the top level class. This was really heavy. This was really serious. It was at literally the top floor of a big building with glass all around us and overlooking the campus and this boardroom setting and all the students sitting around. So they're sort of giving us this feeling like you have now reached the ivory tower experience here. And I'm not even in the program. I don't know how they let me into the class, but here we are discussing things. And I remember one discussion was very interesting. They posed the question, by the way, all the students around this table are the ones who are going to now go and work for the Defense Department, the FBI, CIA, the think tanks, the American Enterprise Institute, all these different groups. And so they're asked a very important question. If there happened to be a major attack, some sort of terrorist event in Manhattan where there was a nuclear attack, what would happen? What would you propose we do as a country, as a government? You're the future policymakers of America. What happens? I'm sitting here listening as they go around the room, and I'm the last one on the line, and I'm hearing full-scale invasion of, Iran, or targeted first strikes of such and such a place, or special forces invasion over in this area, or just carpet bomb Mecca and Medina, all these different answers. And it gets to me, and I said, the first thing I would do is find out who did it, which I thought was a reasonable answer. But they all looked, and then I said, and maybe ask questions about whether American foreign policy may actually stir up resentment and anger. And this is not to justify it, of course, but you want to start to say, hey, let's re-examine our own policies as well. No, you don't do that. Oh man, that really puts you way out there. And so again, all the criticism came at that point because you just went way outside the box, and you're not allowed to say that. And so that wasn't accepted. After class, some of them were coming up to me still, just like, this one guy, he was insisting that in America we need a domestic security force, we need to have a neo-empire, we need to, in his words, exploit the weak for our own benefit. I'm not making this up. Maybe they're a little bit more honest and blunt at the level here, and not in the publications where it's more sort of hidden in intellectual jargon. But this guy was really insistent on this. And I said, hey, are you saying like we should have a tyranny? Like pretty much in a word? And he said, yes. I said, you don't believe in, the Bill of Rights and limited government and these ideas of freedom? Well, no, that's, he said that could work. I mean, that's the ideal, but it just won't work. And so we need to have, in his words, a tyranny. And so this is the mindset. So I've told you these stories so you can see how thought can collect around a certain way of thinking, no matter the department. In this department, it was that way of thinking. Maybe in another department, it would be a different wing of the political spectrum over here. And the whole system is a system of keeping thought within the boundaries that are set by the opinion makers. And you heard from the congressional investigation, the foundations, the elite of society can influence opinion, can influence thought inordinately, and they can take control of this sort of thing. Now, you might remember from session 1 to review about Prussianization of American schooling, which was just Jesuit education to the core, right? We looked at that as an economic force, and a lot of people look back at that as an industrial era phenomenon. It was way back then that they did that, but today, schools are really designed to help children to become the, best and brightest that they can be. That's what we are aiming for, and certainly there are a lot of people in education who are aiming for that. Very few people align with the agendas of these architects of American schooling. Most people in schooling are well-intentioned. I certainly was, and most of the people I knew, but it's still a toxic system in and of itself. It was conceived in iniquity, and you can try your best within this system, but you're still not going to be able to overthrow the system as one individual in the system. But nonetheless, it is happening today as well. This idea of creating a population of human resources, if you will. I want you to meet Mark Tucker. Mark Tucker is a very important individual in modern times because in 1992, Bill Clinton was elected the President of the United States. And at that time, Mark Tucker was formulating some theories about how to really move American schooling forward. And when the people he favored were elected, Bill and Hillary Clinton, he wrote a letter to Hillary Clinton in 1992. This letter has gone viral. It was published in the Congressional Record, and people have analyzed it. It's the famous letter to Hillary Clinton, okay? But what people often don't talk about is he writes in the letter that he had just been having conversations with David Rockefeller and other opinion makers. So after he comes out of these conversations about American schooling, here's what he says in his letter to Hillary Clinton. He says, "We think the great opportunity you have is to remold the entire American system for," guess what? Human resources. Human resources development. Now, what does that mean, human resources? If you talk in economic terms, there are a lot of resources in society, right? There are natural resources. There's financial capital, but there's also human resources. It is a human being reduced to an economic unit, an economic function, the human being as a resource. So we're crafting the whole system around a student serving in the economy in a way that will, well, as he says in the quote, he says at the end, it needs to be a system driven by client needs. Now, reading in the middle of the quotation as well, he says, what is essential is that we create a seamless web that literally extends from cradle to grave and is the same system for everyone. Now, I've heard people make commentaries about, right, can you imagine, governmental intervention in our lives from cradle to grave? And they usually use this in a negative sort of way of using the phrase. But he's saying, no, from cradle to grave. This is what we want. And the client needs meaning the people who will do the hiring, they need their human resources built and produced in a certain way. So even though it's not the industrial system anymore, today we have an economy that's dependent upon these people coming in and being good employees. He goes on to praise the German system in his letter. So this is a Prussianization of 20th century, the information age. He says the whole national schooling needs to be standardized and everybody needs to be tested by the standards, and teachers should be trained according to these standards. The goal is to not help them become more human, more self-made, more initiative-driven, more creative, to come up with their own way. No, human resources. A fully integrated national system. By the way, if you go all the way back to 1919, 95% of the education world was teachers. 95% of the education employees were teachers. Presently, it's less than 50%. So you have a lot of administrative layers in this bureaucracy forming this system that he is dreaming of. Now, if you take a look at Karen Arnold, she wrote an interesting book called Lives of Promise. What happens to the valedictorians of America? Because we say, we tell kids, succeed in school and you will be something great in your life. Well, she actually did a study of the people who were the best at school. You would think these are going to be the great innovators, right? The great entrepreneurs, the dreamers, the people that come up with new ideas, who really succeed in life in ways that, wow, they really did something special and they really stand out from the crowd and they're serving God or blessing others or coming up with interesting things more than those around them. Not so. The valedictorians in her study, and by the way, they're not bad people. They're really good at school and they get good jobs. That was the results of her findings. They get good jobs. They serve in that system. They become important resources, human resources in the system, but they're not the ones to look for creative breakthroughs in entrepreneurship or becoming independent-minded leaders. And this isn't a criticism of people who do well in school, right? I got the 3.5, which is not valedictorian, but which is a decent GPA. But that GPA and that schooling experience did not give me what I needed to succeed in life. That came later. That came outside of school. And yes, of course, there are some innovators and entrepreneurs and discoverers who happened also to get diplomas and degrees. But maybe their unique and successful life came not because of schooling, but in spite of schooling. You rarely hear from successful people, I credit my success and genius in life to the fact that I had to sit in a desk all day, full-time, almost year-round for 13 years. That's what I credit my greatness to. I mean, people don't say that. I mean, even somebody like Ben Carson, who did go through lots of schooling, had to get the degrees, right? What does he credit his success to as the most prominent neurosurgeon in the world? It was what his mother did in the home, outside of the school hours. She would require him to read a book, write a book report on it, and submit it to her. She would mark it up even though she didn't even know what she was doing. And she would say, do it again. You need to improve this and improve that, and you need to do better. She didn't just give him B-. Now your project is done, and you can just be content and satisfied with mediocrity. That's what school does. It's no, do it again, do it again, do it again, until it's the best you can really do. And so many of the successful graduates talk about how they actually didn't like school, or they didn't fit into the program, or how they were kind of restless and frustrated in the schooling environment. Many of them performed poorly in school. Like Einstein himself got C's in school. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a C student. There are many others too that you could cite as examples. Some of them just frankly dropped out altogether. Here's a list of famous school dropouts. Here you have Thomas Edison, the greatest inventor of all time and a multimillionaire. He dropped out after 3 months of elementary school. Benjamin Franklin, arguably the smartest founding father, dropped out at age 10 after 2 months. Albert Einstein dropped out of high school at age 15, performed poorly on tests. When he did finally go back into schooling to try and get college degrees, he was turned down at first, and it was just a big schooling failure. He only succeeded despite unbeatable odds. Here we also see John D. Rockefeller, history's first billionaire. Rockefeller himself dropped out of high school. Isn't that ironic? Walt Disney dropped out of high school. And I should say, As a quick disclaimer here, these people are not necessarily role models, right? They're just people who had economic success and did something different. So that's not to say that these are people we want to be like. So you probably knew that, but just in case. Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Atlantic Airways and Virgin Records, dropped out of high school to start his own business. Colonel Sanders, founder of KFC, dropped out of elementary school. Charles Dickens dropped out at age 12 to work in a factory for 10 hours per day. Elton John dropped out at age 11. Ray Kroc, the McDonald's tycoon, dropped out of high school at age 15. Isn't that interesting? We also see here Tumblr founder David Karp dropped out of high school at the age of 15 and eventually sold his New York startup company for $1.1 billion. And Blip TV founder Mike Hudak also dropped out of high school. We see some more examples. The top tech company founders of the 20th century. These are the top guys, right? Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Paul Allen, Michael Dell. What did these guys do? They dropped out of college to start their own companies. The founders of Whole Foods, The Container Store, CNN, all these tech companies, Dig, Napster, Blogger, Facebook, WordPress, Dropbox, Box.net, and numerous other tech companies all dropped out of college to start their own companies. And if this is, by the way, a small sampling of the total. If all these people had such tremendous success in being innovators, do we have to ask ourselves, is schooling as necessary as we thought? Maybe people who succeed with lots of schooling are succeeding in spite of schooling, not because of it in many cases. By the way, I should mention as a disclaimer, dropping out and not having Prussian-style schooling is not a good thing in and of itself. It's what you replace it with that counts for something, right? The negation of Prussian schooling, I mean, you could just sit there and stare at a white blank wall all day, or you can play video games all day, and then you're going to amount to nothing, of course, right? So it's the fact that these people had a drive and had something interesting to do and had a pursuit and had a passion. I want to tell you the story also of David Sarnoff. He became the president of RCA, one of the most influential individuals in telecommunications history. Well, he emigrated from Russia as a child. He was completely unschooled when he arrived. He learned to read English in 5 months without any schooling. And then he began to sell newspapers at age 9 to support their now fatherless family. His father had died at that time. By age 14, he owned his own newsstand, and he wanted to work at Marconi Wireless. So he saw an ad for an office boy job application, and he ran in. There was a line of 500 other boys, and he said, no, I'm not going to wait in that line. He runs right in. He opens the door, barges right in, goes to the boss and says, I want this job. I'll be the best employee you've ever had. And he uses that strength of fortitude. He was hired on the spot. And so by the end, by 23 years later, he was the president of the company, all without any schooling, right? John Taylor Gatto, the New York City and New York State Teacher of the Year, has a very interesting comment on how David Sarnoff succeeded. He says the following: Sarnoff was able to move so rapidly because he got a chance to think about serious matters before his 8th birthday, to live a significant life before he was 10. He got a chance to add value to his family and community before he was 15, and a chance to follow his own instincts and ambitions ever after. What school do you know these days that would allow all of that? And I can't disagree with his question. Really, maybe we need to rethink this whole thing. I love the story he also tells. John Taylor Gatto says, I once had a 13-year-old Greek boy named Stanley who only came to school 1 day a month and got away with it because I was his homeroom teacher and doctored the records. By the way, I don't recommend this. It's just an interesting story. Let's read on. I did it because of where he spent the time instead. Stanley had 5 aunts and uncles, all in business for themselves before they were 21. A florist, an unfinished furniture builder, a delicatessen owner, a small restaurateur, and a delivery service operator. Stanley was passed from store to store doing free labor in exchange for an opportunity to learn the business. This way, I decide which business I like well enough to set up for myself, he told me. You tell me what books to read and I'll read them, but I don't have time to waste in school unless I want to end up like the rest of these people, working for somebody else. After I heard that, I couldn't, in good conscience, keep him locked up. Isn't that an interesting story? Really, if somebody's got initiative and ambition, school may be doing more harm than good, as I've said. This statement from Education says, the youth are sent to school to acquire knowledge by the study of books, cut off from the responsibilities of everyday life. They become absorbed in study and often lose sight of its purpose. Upon their graduation, thousands find themselves out of touch with life. And there is no doubt in my mind that this Jesuit-style, Prussian-style education needs to be re-examined just based upon this statement alone. It's disconnected from real life, isn't it? In a study on divergent thinking, they actually found that 98% of children aged 3 to 5 scored in what would qualify as creative genius. So children, naturally, young children, have a curiosity, a way of thinking, a divergent way of thinking, a creativity that qualifies them to be a genius. Literally, everybody is born with genius capabilities. And there's something that happens along the line that beats this out of us, that trains this out of us. Because watch what happens after age 3 to 5. After 5 years of schooling, they retested the same children, and only 32% of them ranked as creative geniuses. After 5 more years of school, only 10% of them. And by age 25, only 2% of the population remain as divergent thinkers. Creativity, curiosity, initiative are natural human characteristics. School and media addiction sap the kids of their natural genius. I love what Albert Einstein said. He says it's a miracle that curiosity survives a formal education. Isn't that something? So what do we do with our out of the classroom time? That's the question. Are we pursuing interests to see what God's calling in our lives is? Do we have a passion to learn academic knowledge and skills and how the world works and how to win souls and all of these important last days considerations to live a full life? Or do we just say, school is dumb and boring, so I'm going to go get entertained and immerse myself in media? That's the present reality. And people say, these teenagers though, they are just bored in school, and that's their fault. Well, maybe it's not. The longer kids are in school, when they're first in school, they're all rearing to go. They're excited. And the longer they're in school, the more bored they get and the more negative feelings they have towards school. And you know what lesson they learn in school more than anything else? The lesson is that learning is drudgery. That learning is boring, that learning is something to be avoided whenever possible for the most part. And believe it or not, kids, even in turn of the century, 20th century factories, these miserable, unsafe conditions, they were far happier there than in the Jesuit Prussian-style schools that were coming in. Helen Todd published a report called Why Children Work in McClure's magazine in 1913. She surveyed hundreds of children working in the factories who had escaped the compulsory schooling laws. And what we found is that 82% of the kids working there said that they would rather work in the factories than return to these factory schools, if you will. So these miserable working conditions were less miserable than Prussian schooling. And it's a modern example too. In 1982, 8,000 Milwaukee children, high school age kids who had left high school to work, they were asked the following question. If you could return to school and get paid the same amount that you get paid to work at this job, would you do it? And you know what? Out of 8,000 of them, only 16 said that they would willingly go back to school and get paid for it. When people blame the teenager, they said the teenager is just a naturally apathetic age. It's adolescence. They just kind of float through life and they enter into this weird holding pattern before they become adults and they'll just grow out of it. Is this thing inevitable? It's not. Research has shown it. Research has been done on kids who have escaped the compulsory schooling system, like homeschool kids, for example. They're not products of modern schooling. And so what is the difference? Through adolescence, they retain their natural curiosity, their zest for learning and for life, all the way through childhood and into adulthood, all the way through adolescence. They don't go through this period. We have a 5-year-old, right? A 5-year-old is naturally curious. He wants to learn. He's out about doing everything. He's asking questions. He loves life. He's creative. And then all of a sudden we assume, well, just because we've been taught that this is the way things are supposed to go, well, once he's 5, he's supposed to go to school. And then he learns differently. He learns what he's told to learn and the way he's told to learn it. And this is a system. This is an organized method of learning. Now, of course, this is not to toss out all order and organization. If you're doing a home school, you want to have some order in the day. But the child doesn't get to exercise his curiosity, his natural inquisitiveness, learning and studying things that he desires to learn and study. No. This system now needs to put him in place, and we've seen the results. We go from 98% of them being creative geniuses at age 3 to 5 to at age 25, only 2% being creative geniuses. It's virtually wiping out creativity from almost 100% to almost 0%. So no matter whether you're in school or whether you're homeschooled or whatever, the more time you spend outside of the classroom doing real things, studying, thinking, learning practical skills, living life, serving others, doing things the way God designed it, the more happy children and youth are. Now, people might say, in our 21st century age, things are different than they used to be. Watch this with the 21st century technology. This is amazing. The man on the screen that you see is Sugata Mitra. And he did an interesting experiment in Indian villages in India, the most poor communities. And he put these computers in public places and with the internet. And the children flocked to these things to figure out how to use them and to learn. They're naturally wanting to learn. They're inquisitive, right? And kids who did not know how to read were totally ignorant. They now learned how to read on their own with each other at the screens. And not just that, they learned things like about microorganisms and viruses and bacteria, and they started talking about this in their community. You have to wonder if schooling as we know it is becoming obsolete and not completely. I mean, I don't want to toss out the concept of a school institution because, we've been given a pretty good blueprint for that as the people of God, which we will talk about in the upcoming seminar, Undoctrinated. But here's an example, Mr. Mitra and the Indian children that I really appreciate. Over half a century ago, though, Robert Ulick warned his fellow social planners, and he said, watch out, guys. We are producing more and more people who will be dissatisfied because the artificially prolonged time of formal schooling will arouse in them hopes which society cannot fulfill. So kids are going to be told, if you just stay in school, if you get the degree, if you go to college, if you do these things, then you will be successful. And he says, be careful. These hopes are not going to be fulfilled, and they're going to be disappointed. Over 72% of students who have finished college over the past few years in America have had to move back with their parents, strapped with tens of thousands of dollars of student loan debt. 35% of college students say that they regret the time and money spent on the 4 years of college. Over half of them say, I pretty much learned nothing that was useful. So Robert Ulick's statement is being fulfilled today. And Abraham Lincoln, if we go back into the mid-19th century, he taught and believed that literally every person was capable of developing an independent livelihood, being a proprietor, being an initiator, doing something with your life where you're not just dependent upon others. He believed that being a laborer, a wage laborer, was a temporary condition on the path to doing something for yourself. And that sounds maybe so impossible, like we can't all do that. Is it impossible? Take a look at the Amish. The Amish today, almost 100% of them, are proprietors of small farms or enterprises. Almost 100%. And their businesses have only a 5% rate of failure, compared with American businesses, which are 85% rate of failure. Almost all businesses, startups, fail. The Amish, almost all of them succeed. And they were not given this success on a platter, silver platter, by the way. They have faced unbelievable odds. Governments have tried to destroy their way of life, yet the Amish live prosperous lives. And they're not perfect. I'm not saying we should be like them or join them and they're the model and standard for everybody. But the interesting thing is, their society is virtually crime-free, divorce-free. They're not on welfare. Yet none of them have gotten even a high school diploma, let alone a college degree. They learn academically, they do, and through the 8th grade. But during this time, they're also learning practical things about real life. In the last century in America, we've seen the family has been destroyed. We have become dumber, we are dependent, and we are spiritually empty. So I have to wonder, maybe the Amish are a lot closer to the goal than the rest of us. This man you see on the screen is named Carroll Quigley. He's a very important individual because as a scholar, he was given the opportunity to study the secret records and the files and papers of the organizations of the elite. And he wrote sort of the textbook on what you might say is the movement of the elite in the 20th century, the New World Order movement, you might call it. The book is called Tragedy and Hope. And actually, Bill Clinton referred to Carroll Quigley in his acceptance speech for the Democratic National Convention when he was nominated as the candidate for the presidency in 1992. He says, I learned a lot from my mentor, Carroll Quigley. Well, what does Carroll Quigley have to say? In this book, he talks about, the movement of the elite and so on, and that's interesting. But he also had a speech. Right before his death, he gave a speech in 1976. And in his speech, he said the following: "Now I come to my last statement. The final result will be that the American people will ultimately opt out of the system. Today, everything is a bureaucratic structure, and brainwashed people who are not personalities are trained to fit into this bureaucratic structure and say it is a great life. The process of opting out will take a long time. When Rome fell, the Christian answer was create our own communities." And that's what we can do, and that's what we've done. We can say, why do we need to be a part of that system? Opt out. create our own communities. It's still legal. I don't know for how much longer, but millions of Americans have just said, we're just going to educate our children at home and in the community. Don't waste your time trying to reform the schools, by the way. If you're looking at this, the schools must change. I learned a lot about the history of, you're not going to change the system. Just opt out and say we don't need to be brainwashed, as Carol Quigley put it. The same applies with, the way you view Hollywood. You might have seen Media on the Brain and said, we're going to shut down Hollywood. Let's wage a culture war. You know what? You can shut down Hollywood by unplugging it from your own home. You can say, we're going to toss out all these video games. We're going to toss out the schooling, brainwashing nonsense. We can take control of our own lives. If you're not happy with the medical system and the philosophy that's happening in medicine in America, well, study natural remedies, live a healthful life, and do things differently on your own, in your home, with your own communities, your own church. This is the beauty of living life God's way. You don't have to be victims of this system. Now, these 2 sessions that we've finished now have only been for the very limited the purpose of exposing the facade of modern schooling. What's really under the surface? What are the roots of it? But there is still a lot more that needs to be said. How do we opt out? What do we do instead? And so for the sequel of Schooled, be sure to take a look at Undoctrinated. How do we do true education? Whether at home or whether on a school campus. I can't wait to do this seminar because we've just torn down the edifice. Let's build up something beautiful and wonderful that God has inspired us with. We'll look at the history of the homeschool movement. We'll look at the Adventist education blueprint and we'll say, wow, this is such a cool alternative to the mind programming, the Prussianization, and the Jesuitization of American schooling that has taken place in the last 100 years. We will be inspired to do something beautiful. But don't stick around for that. Study it for yourself. Read education. Read Fundamentals of Christian Education. Read counsels to parents, teachers, and students. And do something different. Let's close with prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for a beautiful vision of how we are to train and educate our children. I pray that as we move forward from opting out of the enemy's plan and system, that we can look to you with obedience, with faith, and with a hope of something beautiful and wonderful. You're soon coming. And Lord, we know we must be prepared by having minds that can think and discern. And we know that the enemy of souls, the powers of darkness, seek to gain control of the human mind. And Father, we do not want to be victims of that last day's deception. So give us fortitude of mind, strength of character, and everything that we need to be prepared and preparing our children. In Jesus' name, amen.